Good morning and welcome to yet another episode of The League of Biblical Enthusiasts. Well, last week we said that we would cover the story of two twin spinster Presbyterian widows who discovered some very important early Syriac manuscripts of the New Testament in the Sinai desert, specifically at the monastery of St. Catherine. Where have we heard of this place before? Well, if you've been listening to our earlier episodes, you'll know this very well. These two sisters join at least two other 19th century manuscript hunters that we've discussed, Robert Curzon and Constantine Tischendorf. For much of the detail in this episode, I rely on Janice Soska's excellent biography, The Sisters of Sinai, How Two Lady Adventurers Discovered the Hidden Gospels. Do yourself a favor, go to YouTube, look up this author, Janet Soskas, and you will find some amazing information and entertaining details about these two sisters and their discoveries. Well, just who were these two sisters? What is their background story? How is it they developed such a curiosity to travel to dangerous places in the Middle East? What did they find there? How did they find it? And what is the significance of their discoveries to the study of the New Testament today? Well, that's why we're here. So please enjoy a 30-second intro or skip ahead to the story brought to you by the League of Biblical Enthusiasts. The story begins on January 11th, 1843, when parents John Smith and Margaret Dunlop were welcoming their two twin daughters into the world. Agnes was the older by an hour, and she took her responsibilities very seriously for her younger sister, Margaret. Their father was a Scottish lawyer, and unfortunately his wife died 2 weeks later due to complications from the childbirth. He never remarried, and he determined to set his daughters up to be self-sufficient and resilient, and this proved to be true. John Smith had done well for himself. At age 40, he had built up a healthy legal practice and was the owner of a comfortable home in Irvine, Scotland. He was a strict Presbyterian and valued his daughters' education highly. So he sent them to the Irvine Royal Academy, where both boys and girls were educated together in the same room and studied the same subjects. Both girls had a gift for languages, and their father made them a prescient promise. For every foreign language they learned, he would take them to the country where that language was spoken. As we will see, their language skills and early travel experiences would greatly assist their future life of adventure in the Middle East. With this enticing promise hanging before them, they soon learned French, German, Spanish, and Italian. And it turned out they would be learning more languages in the future, mostly ancient ones, but more about that later. Little did the twins know that during their teenage years, their father, and by extension, they too, would become extremely wealthy. And here's how it happened. When the twins were 13 years old, a distant kinsman, a certain John Ferguson, for whom their father did legal work, left their father a tremendous sum of money. Long story short, Mr. Ferguson's 5 uncles had left Scotland for America, and each had become independently wealthy through hard work and investing in the booming railroad industry. None of the 5 brothers had married or even made a will. And when the final one died in 1842, their collective fortune came back to their nephew, John Ferguson, in Irvine, Scotland. It was John Smith, the twins' father, who assisted Ferguson, now a multimillionaire, with investing his fortune in railroad networks and other ventures. Ferguson was drawing up his will and asked Smith how much money his estate was worth now. Smith calculated it to be around £1.25 million. In today's money, some £75 million. And after leaving his money to various parties and charities, Ferguson left the remainder to John Smith, the twins' father, who was also Ferguson's personal attorney and the son of Ferguson's second nephew. Smith's share was, in today's money, worth £7 million. Suddenly, John Smith and his girls were set for life. Smith made sure the girls would not be taken advantage of by a greedy husband, because at this time all of a woman's property would go to the husband upon marriage, but Smith used his attorney skills and developed a will to ensure this could not happen. Both girls had completed schooling at Birkenhead and then spent the next year in a London finishing school. Now at 23 years of age, they were looking forward to a life of marriage and motherhood, but it didn't happen as soon as they had wished. Both twins were still single in 1866 when their father unexpectedly died after a brief illness. So, at 23 years old, they were both single, fatherless, but fabulously wealthy. Now, what would they do? Well, of course, they would travel down the Nile. During their life, they would make 9 journeys to Egypt, and so opens a new chapter in their life. Both had traveled with their father and believed he would be pleased with their visit to the Holy Land. They planned to travel without a male escort and enlisted a former schoolmistress, Grace Blythe, who was 12 years older, to accompany them. And their guidebook for the trip was the ever-popular Murray's Guidebook to Modern Egypt and Thebes. Murray's listed 3 ways to reach Egypt from England. Number 1, sail directly to Alexandria from Southampton. Number 2, travel by railway across France to Marseille and then by steamer to Suez. And lastly, number 3, travel by ferry, train, and carriage across Europe to the Danube, down the Danube by steamboat to the Black Sea, and then from Constantinople take a steamer to Alexandria. This last option, which was the most expensive and lengthy, is the one they chose to travel. Even though travel to the Middle East was becoming more common, it was still typically reserved for the very wealthy and was not without its dangers. Dysentery and infectious diseases was a real possibility. A cholera plague had recently broken out in Alexandria. And then at some point, you must trust yourself to a local guide called a dragoman to accompany you across the desert with his band of Bedouins. Murray's guidebook recommended taking wine instead of drinking the local water, a healthy supply of insect powder, guns, gunpowder, and a medicine chest with a remedy for diarrhea. And so the twins set off for adventure in August 1868, planning to be away for a year. In December 1868, they had reached Constantinople and boarded a steamer that set a course to traverse the eastern Mediterranean with ports of call at Smyrna, Rhodes, Cyprus, Beirut, Jaffa, and then their final port of call, Alexandria, and then by land to Cairo. At Cairo, they hired a dragoman for their Nile excursion. A dragoman was essentially a personal travel agent who would handle all details of your trip, from acquiring the boat, hiring the captain, the crew, the cooks, and so on. His contract provided you with all necessary provisions, including acting as a guide and interpreter, since at this time none of the ladies could speak Arabic. Not yet, that is. They traveled the Nile, saw many sights, missed others due to the quirky, mischievous personality of the dragoman. On returning to Cairo, they ditched their dragoman for a more trustworthy fellow for their trip to Jerusalem. So they set out from Alexandria by steamer to Jaffa, this time with Murray's guidebook to Syria in hand. and from Jaffa they traveled northward on land and soon ascended the mountain with Jerusalem in view. Jerusalem was quite a disappointment to them. As devout Protestant Presbyterians, they were disillusioned at the various Christian sects, Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Armenian, Coptic, all vying for prominence with their holy sites and all displaying candles, icons, incense, shrines, and holy relics of the saints at almost every site. The ladies considered these idolatrous. At Easter Eve, they attended the ceremony of the Holy Fire, which, if you've never seen it, is quite an amazing experience. The ceremony anticipates the first light of Easter. There's darkness in the church as the ceremony begins. A priest exits the tomb of Christ with his lighted torch and is passed from candle to everyone in the church. Darkness becomes light. The crowd erupts in shouts of Christos Anesti, and enthusiasm leads to a noisy celebration. They watched it unfold from a visitor's gallery on an upper floor. Then, after these trips, they also went to Bethlehem and Nazareth. They returned to London in August 1869, almost 1 year after they departed. They made their home in Pembridge Square, Kensington, and began a new life there. Agnes wrote of her recent Middle Eastern trip in the travel diary entitled Eastern Pilgrims, The Travel of Three Ladies, and published it in 1870. A link to this colorful diary online and others is left for you in the description box. In the meantime, both sisters devoted themselves to their Sunday school teaching, serving in the soup kitchen, and investing their time in learning new languages, especially Greek. We unfortunately must hastily cover much of their story, so we'll note that Margaret began a romantic relationship with a Mr. James Gibson, who at the time was a Presbyterian minister. Their relationship was on again, off again, for 13 years. When finally he proposed, she accepted, and they married in September 1883. Margaret was 40 years old and James 57. Their marriage was short-lived as James died 3 years later of tuberculosis. To raise her grief-stricken sister's spirits, Agnes suggested a tour of Cambridge. That same day, they made the acquaintance of the man who would become Agnes's future husband. He was a librarian of Corpus Christi College, an antiquarian and collector, the Reverend Samuel Savage Lewis. A close friendship based on a true meeting of the minds quickly deepened, and Agnes married in December 1887. Lewis's expertise in ancient texts and biblical manuscripts made him a fitting intellectual partner for Agnes. Unfortunately, their marriage was also short-lived. Just over 3 years into the marriage, Lewis died of a heart attack as the couple traveled in a train from Oxford. Lewis's unexpected death affected Agnes badly, for she had lost both her husband and access to the academic world she had enjoyed through him. This time it was Margaret's turn to coax Agnes out of her sorrow by planning another adventurous trip. The twins decided to visit St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai, a destination that had long called to Agnes, given its identification as a location where Moses saw the burning bush. During their first few years in Cambridge, the twins had begun to study Hebrew and Arabic. Agnes also became determined to study Syriac, similar to Aramaic, and many believed that it was Jesus' native language. Agnes was also introduced to James Rendell Harris, the English biblical scholar who revealed to the sisters that he believed important manuscripts still remained to be found at Sinai, and confided to them the secret of a dark closet in the monastery beneath the archbishop's rooms that contained chests of Syriac manuscripts he had not been able to examine on a previous trip. In the hopes that the twins would get the chance to see these manuscripts, he taught them how to use a camera. The twins' incredible journey to Mount Sinai at the age of 49 in January 1892 is described in detail in the travel diary How the Codex was found. A narrative compiled by Margaret based on her sister Agnes's journals. And just today, by chance, I received a first and signed edition by Margaret from Tel Aviv. It's inscribed with these words: To Professor and Mrs. Blackie, a token of affectionate esteem from the authoress. And I happened to look up this professor, and he indeed is a scholar of ancient languages, and I'm confident that's who it was addressed to. So, again, a link to this book is found at archive.org, where you can find many older manuscripts and documents that are out of print. Friends in Cambridge had advised the twins that women would not be welcome at St. Catherine's Monastery. As for the opportunity to view the manuscripts, it was well known the monks were more skeptical toward visitors now after their unfortunate experience with Tischendorf, whose story we recounted in our last several episodes. Luckily, after traveling for 9 days in the desert, the sisters received a warm welcome. The monks were bound to treat two women travelers courteously, and these two sisters happened to be now fluent in modern Greek, which made communication easy and set them apart from previous scholars who could not speak the monks' language. The twins were also armed with letters of recommendation from the Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University and from Rendell Harris, who had visited the monastery in the recent past and who was trusted by the monks. The sisters were greeted by the prior of the monastery and by the librarian, Father Galaction, both of whom, according to Agnes, were, quote, delighted at being able to converse with us in their own tongue. When asked what they wished to see, Agnes boldly replied, all your oldest Syriac manuscripts, particularly those which Dr. Harris had not time to examine, for I want to take a report of them to him. Galaction, who was predisposed towards any friend of Rendell Harris, immediately took her to explore the dark closet that Dr. Harris had mentioned. The second manuscript that she examined in the closet was a 358-page palimpsest codex upon which she spied some faint Syriac script in the undertext. Agnes was clearly the first person to examine this manuscript in a long time, for it was in poor condition and a steam kettle was needed to separate its leaves. The main text, or the upper script, was a Greek martyrology of female saints written around the 8th century. However, Agnes' knowledge of Syriac enabled her to spot that every word of the lower script was from the Gospels. Furthermore, she noticed a date in the colophon of the upper text and realized that the lower, hidden Syriac script had to be at least several centuries earlier. Agnes was convinced that the palimpsest was an important discovery, but she would need to have experts in Syriac confirm her suspicions and identify the work, and thus she determined to photograph the entire piece. The twins returned to Cambridge with 1,000 photographic negatives of the manuscript that would form the basis of their future scholarship. But Agnes faced resistance to get the Sinai Palimpsest noticed by the experts. It took the sisters 6 weeks to develop their negatives and to index them. The first photographs they developed were not sufficiently clear to reveal to others what Agnes had seen with her own eyes. Furthermore, some were probably not convinced that a lady traveler, lacking in formal academic qualifications, would have the skill to find such an important manuscript. Repeated invitations to view the photographs were ignored until, in desperation, Agnes resorted to a ruse. She arranged a dinner party to which she invited Professor F.C. Burkitt, a Cambridge Syriac scholar, and his wife. And at the end of the party, Agnes casually invited Burkitt to look at the photographs that had been conveniently left out on the table. She explained these were Syriac Gospels dated no later than the 5th century. Burkitt showed great interest and asked if he might review a few images at his home, and she quickly agreed. That was a Friday. On Saturday morning, the twins received an excited note from Dr. Burkitt's wife, which read, My dear Mrs. Lewis, Frank is in a state of the highest excitement. He wrote down a portion of the palimpsest last night and has been in to Dr. Bensley with it, and they've discovered it is a copy of the Curitan Syriac. Did you know only one copy exists? You can imagine Frank's glee. He has just been in to tell me and has run back to the Bensleys. I thought you would be interested. I am yours affectionately, A. Persis Burkitt. Now, at this time, the only known Syriac text of the Gospels was a version called the Peshitta, and the recently discovered Curitan Gospels. Professor Robert Bensley was the famed expert in Hebrew and Syriac at Cambridge and a good friend of Dr. Burkitt. Burkitt told Agnes that Bensley urged the utmost secrecy to their discovery. They met at Bensley's home to discuss this matter further. Since the photographs were not of the highest quality, they agreed to return to St. Catherine's to copy the text from the originals. The sisters, together with Bensley, Burkitt, and their wives, and Rendell Harris, formed a party which returned to Sinai to read and transcribe the palimpsest. Agnes recorded this trip in her narrative entitled In the Shadow of Sinai. The experience, however, was not all positive or happy. Disagreements abounded and scholarly resentment was sometimes high. Burkitt believed Harris was trying to upstage him, and he believed that Harris was his intellectual inferior. But the transcriptions were completed, not least with the help of Agnes' recently acquired reagent, which is called hydrosulfide of ammonia, and is a chemical which temporarily lifts the lower text by restoring its color, and her success in gaining the monk's permission to take the manuscripts outdoors into the light. The party was sworn to secrecy about the find until they could return to Cambridge to announce it together. But a letter from Rendell Harris to a correspondent in Germany went out early, and news of this major discovery broke to the public without any reference to Drs. Bensley and Burkitt. This just confirmed Burkitt's fears about Harris. The already rocky friendship now turned sour, and with Bensley's death just a few months after they returned, the project to jointly publish the work was on hold. These circumstances, however, propelled the twins into the world of scholarship. The palimpsest was eventually published with a weighty introduction by Agnes, some 24 pages in length, even though the collaborators had originally agreed to let her write it only if it were brief. Agnes used the introduction to prove her worth as a serious scholar by providing a detailed description of the manuscript, a careful explanation of the complex arrangement of the quires, and a confident discussion about the contents of the upper script. The question of the palimpsest's significance sparked much debate. Burkitt continued to regard the Sinai Codex as a copy of the Curitan Codex, while Agnes came to believe that the Sinai Palimpsest reflected an older translation than the Curitan, and was a copy of the very first attempt to render the Gospels into Syriac. Agnes's great passion for defending the significance of the Sinai Palimpsest was to last for the rest of her life, and she would visit the monastery 6 times to examine it. On a visit in 1895, she studied the palimpsest again, and the next year published new transcriptions, distinguishing them from previous readings by printing them in blue ink. She returned to Sinai to make more transcriptions in 1897 and again in 1902. Agnes made the arduous journey to St. Catherine's for the 6th and last time in 1906 at the age of 63, and the result was her magnum opus, the Old Syriac Gospels. It contained a new transcription of the text using variants from the Curitan Codex with corroborations from other manuscripts and a list of quotations by the Syriac fathers, plus a lengthy introduction, a bibliography of every publication dealing with the Sinai Palimpsest, critical notes, and facsimiles of the manuscripts. Agnes took great satisfaction in correcting Burkitt's earlier work on the palimpsest, and by adding a substantial amount of new material, established the Sinai Palimpsest as the superior source to the Cureton Codex. The manuscript has forever resided in the monastery of St. Catherine's. Current scholarship judges Agnes as correct in judging the Sinai Palimpsest as slightly older than the Cureton Gospels. Thus, the Sinai Palimpsest is dated to the late or 4th or early 5th century and is considered the oldest surviving Syriac translation of the Gospels. Two current scholars specializing in the study of ancient Syriac manuscripts, including the Sinai Palimpsest, are Sebastian P. Brock of Oxford University and Claudia Rapp of the University of Vienna. Well, we must close this chapter of the adventure of the Sisters of Sinai. But fear not, there is more to come. If you think the story of these two Presbyterian spinsters was over, you are woefully mistaken. Next week, we'll discuss even more discoveries made by these two ladies and their relationship with the Jewish scholar Solomon Schechter. So don't miss it. Thanks for listening. And if you have enjoyed this series, please like, subscribe, and share it with others. So we'll see you soon, and be well from the League of Biblical Enthusiasts.